Welcome to another episode of On This Day on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. I'm your host for On This Day, Mike Goodpasser, and today we're going to talk about December the 17th, 1944. Now, that's the day that the Green Bay Packers beat the New York Giants 14-7 for their sixth and final league title under longtime head coach Curly Lambeau. So today, we're not necessarily talking about the game, but we're going to talk about Curly Lambeau. Because Curly Lambeau was a fascinating and enigmatic individual. In the prime of his life, he was a national celebrity, someone who hobnobbed in high society and found himself in the spotlight nearly everywhere he went. Like many notable leaders, he had an insatiable appetite for power, women, and riches. His imperfections and indiscretions alienated many of the men who played for him, cost him 3 wives, and galvanized a small force of enemies who usurped his authority and drove him out of Green Bay. But his legacy is written all over one of the 2 most storied franchises in the NFL, and his name is emblazoned across what may be the country's most famous football shrine. He certainly was very human. And Lee Remmel, who was a young sports writer covering the team, had this to say about Lambeau. He's the guy who founded the Packers in company with George Calhoun and then kept them together for a long, long time. A lot of people around the country have the perception that the Packers originated with Vince Lombardi. That's obviously totally erroneous, but I feel Curly gets cheated nationally because of it. I've said many times that if it hadn't been for Curly Lambeau, there would have been no Vince Lombardi. There would have been no Green Bay Packers. Now, with that glowing testament as a backdrop, we're going to take a look today at 2 sides. But really, there were many sides to Earl Louis Curly Lambeau. Now, Lambeau coached the NFL for 33 years, including 29 with the Packers. Only George Halas coached longer. He won 226 games, lost 132, tied 22. Only Halas, Shula, Landry have won more. He won 6 NFL championships. Only George Halas has won 6. Well, what's Bill Belichick at? 5 or 6. He'll break, Lambeau's record anyways by the time they're done. But his players never once carried him off the field in the celebration. For every player who believed in him, there was another who despised him for being insincere and untrustworthy. I don't think guys played out of respect for Curly as much as they played out of fear of Curly, said Bob Snyder, who served as an assistant coach with the Packers in 1949. A lot of guys didn't like Paul Brown. A lot of guys didn't like Lombardi, but they respected them. I think they were just scared of Curly. Lambeau wasn't necessarily a tyrant on the field, but he had strict rules, and he let everybody know who the boss was. He would slap players with steep, unreasonable fines at an age when they made meager money. He would threaten their jobs. He would place the blame for mistakes and defeats squarely on their shoulders instead of accepting the blame himself. I remember I called him up once after we lost a game, said Art Daly, a retired sports writer who covered the Packers in the 1940s. Andy Uram fumbled at the end. I think it was against the Bears. Curly said, "We didn't lose the ball game. Andy Uram did." Of course, players who were more secure were more willing to stand up to him. I remember a deal once where Mike McClaskey and Carl Hubbard backed him against the wall one time over some money or something. Howie Leviatus, a director emeritus of the Packers board who began his association with the team as a water boy in 1928, and said in reference to the team's 2 Hall of Fame linemen, they literally backed him against the wall in the dressing room. More often than not, players had a beef with Lambeau, and it was usually over money. They groused to each other that he had deceived them in negotiations and even reneged on the terms of their contract. But the times where Lambeau lost control were very rare. He had a reputation for being a disciplinarian, much more so than for being a brilliant tactician. Early in his career, he was considered one of the pioneers of the forward pass. He also has been credited with being the first coach to hold daily practices and watching film. But many of these players openly questioned his knowledge of the game. Some even suggested that it had passed him by at the end. A proponent of the old Notre Dame box, Lambeau was one of the last coaches in the NFL to switch to the T formation. He made the move in 1947, but had little success thereafter. When I got on his staff, I was surprised, said Snyder. We had very few meetings. It just didn't seem like he really had any system. The plays to the left side weren't the same as the plays to the right side, and I don't remember looking at movies. What made Lambeau such a success when he was a master salesman and motivator? Before the college draft was introduced in 1936, he sold a long list of great players on the idea of coming to Green Bay. And once they arrived, he inspired them to great heights with his competitive fire, his unbridled enthusiasm, and his artful powers of persuasion. He could really get you worked up, said Snyder. Lambeau would stir players with his oratory. He grabbed their attention by storming the sidelines, ranting and raving, stomping his feet and kicking at air, before sending him into the game. He'd grab them by the jersey, incessantly pound them on the back for encouragement, and exhort them to play the game of their lives. I was charmed by him, said Dick Wilden, a former Pro Bowl tackle who played with the Packers from 1946 to 1951, and again then in 1953. I thought he was a good guy to play for. Wilding may have been in the minority. A lot of people didn't, said Johnston, but I thought he was great. Now, if there was anything Lambeau liked better than football, it was women. He was an unabashed ladies' man. He really was, said Mary Jane Sorgel, who lives in Green Bay and was once known as the Packers' Golden Girl, when she was serving as a drum majorette for the team's lumberjack band. And as far as I'm concerned, when I was with him, he didn't have any other ladies, but he was charming to everybody. My mother even thought he was charming. Sorgel was Lambeau's girlfriend when he died in 1965 at age 67. She was roughly half his age. By then, Lambeau had been married and divorced 3 times. His first wife was his high school sweetheart. His second wife was a former Miss California. His third wife was divorced from a Hollywood film director. Women found Lambeau ruggedly handsome. He stood 6'1", weighed 200 and some pounds, and walked with an erect, graceful style. He also liked to coat himself with body fragrances and dress in sharp, flashy clothes. He was a wonderful fella, but an oddball, really, said Jim Szymanski, who served as equipment man for the Packers in 1942. He wouldn't go anywhere until his hair was combed perfectly. Always dressed nice, loved women. He always made sure he was out with somebody. Women weren't the only ones attracted to Lambeau's charm. So were sports writers. In the Packers' early years, when they were struggling for survival and in desperate need of publicity, Lambeau always knew what to say to attract headlines and attention. In the late 1930s, when he continued to win championships, he was introduced in nightclubs in New York like Bill Tilden and Jack Dempsey, said Bremmel in reference to 2 legendary sports figures of the 20s and 30s. That was the so-called golden age of sports, and Curly had become a national figure. Lambeau also felt at home in California, where he often spent his off-seasons. He purchased a residence in the exclusive Malibu Beach area and befriended a number of well-known Hollywood entertainers. He lived a life of luxury, driving big, fancy cars and always carrying a large wad of bills in his pocket. And even though he was immensely proud of his physique and he was unusually, especially for at that time, health conscious, Lambeau also smoked cigarettes back then. Perhaps he was just trying to be cool. He never inhaled, said Daly, a heavy smoker at the time. He'd draw on it and puff it right out. Sounds like Bill Clinton. Lambeau's California lifestyle didn't go over well in his native Green Bay, especially when his team started to lose in the late 40s. They said he had gone Hollywood, said Bremmel. He spent a considerable amount of time in the off-season, and some people said in L.A., and a lot of people said that is what led to the team not having the success it wouldn't have. He wasn't paying attention to the business of football. In 1948, the Packers finished 3-9, their first losing season in 15 years. The following year, they lost their opener to the Chicago Bears 17-0. 5 days later, Lambeau announced that he was turning over the team to his 3 assistants and kicking himself upstairs to become an advisory coach. The Packers spent the season rudderless and in turmoil. On November the 30th, with the team in the midst of a 6-game losing streak, the board of directors met at the Brown County Courthouse to determine Lambeau's future. He had ruled the franchise like an autocrat for more than 25 years, but with the Packers losing money and heading towards a second straight disastrous season, he had become vulnerable. Lambeau's authority had gradually been undermined. He also made a number of enemies. 3 years earlier, he had dismissed Calhoun, who had helped him found the team, from his post as publicity director. A bitter Calhoun plotted with his friends on the board to oust Lambeau, but couldn't garner enough support. After 5 hours of acrimonious debate, Lambeau emerged from the meeting and announced that he had been offered a new 2-year contract as coach and general manager. However, he still hadn't signed it 2 months later. On February 1st, 1950, the man who had been the heart and soul of the Green Bay Packers since their founding in 1919 resigned to become head coach of the Chicago Cardinals. He coached 4 more seasons, 2 with the Cardinals and then 2 with the Redskins, before leaving football, returning only to coach the college All-Stars. On June 1st, 1965, Lambeau died in Sturgeon Bay of a massive heart attack. He was cutting the grass at the time at his home. Now, the story goes here that he was cutting the grass at the home of Frances Van Dusen, a good friend. Sorgel was there. She was Van Dusen's daughter. And Sorgel said about that fateful day, he was mowing our lawn just for fun. He was showing me how he had learned to do it with a twist in California. All of a sudden, he fell right into my dad's arms. And that was it. So, on this day, December the 17th, 1944, almost forgot the date there, December 17th, 1944, Curly Lambeau led the Green Bay Packers to their 6th NFL championship with a 14-7 win over the New York Giants, and that's the story of Curly Lambeau. All right, guys, remember you can join us every day for On This Day. The shows will be posted around 10 o'clock Eastern Time on thegrillingtruth.com. Make sure you come back and join us tomorrow. Follow us at Twitter, @GrillingTruth. You can hear us wherever you find sports podcasts. So, this has been Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to The Grilling Truth, where the legends speak.